China and the United States ease nearly 2 years of trade tensions with the signing of a Phase 1 trade agreement. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In a White House ceremony, Chinese Vice Premier Liu He and U.S. President Donald Trump formalized a partial trade deal between the two countries. The agreement cuts some U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods in exchange for Chinese pledges to purchase more American farm, energy and manufactured goods. It also addresses some U.S. complaints about China's intellectual property practices. For more, we turn now to CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. So Nathan, a big signing ceremony at the White House today. Lay it out for us. What does each side get in this initial deal?
Well, I mean, if you're cynical, essentially what they get is a pause in the 18-month trade war. As you said, tariffs remain in place. But actually, if you're more optimistic and look into the future, essentially what this is a negotiation between the two biggest economies who have two very different systems, or two very different stages of development, and how to square the circle of their two different demands and requirements, and also help the world economy on its way. You know, there's been a lot of focus here in the US about the trade deficit. That's US President Trump's obsession. But China has also said, look, we're going to import more as our middle class grows and the structure of our economy changes from an export model to a consumption model. So essentially, what they've done here to sort of settle this trade tension is to come up with a sort of roadmap of purchases over the next 2 years above what was the 2017 level, you know, where all this started, if you like. And so the top line number, and I think we've got a chart here, is about $200 billion. But if you break it down, it's in all the sectors that China needs, but also the US wants to change the balance on. So we're talking about manufactured goods, $77 billion. Agriculture, $32 billion. Energy, we're talking about liquefied natural gas and all the energy that the US has discovered over the last few years, $52.5 billion. Services, $38 billion. And a lot of this squares with what China has been doing since essentially the 19th Party Congress, which is continuing reform and opening up. We think of the foreign investment law, for example, that was just introduced at the beginning of the year. We think of also the financial services regulations, which have now allowed majority and 100% ownership, for example, of financial services. So, you know, while the US is saying this is a win for them, it's actually essentially, to use the phrase that we've used, often a win-win. Let's listen to Vice Premier Liu He's reaction.
This is an extensive agreement. After it is signed, China will work with the U.S. in the principle of equality and mutual respect, quickly honor the agreement, accommodate each other's core concerns, and ensure the good implementation of the Phase 1 trade agreement.
Now, of course, US President Trump, in his usual style, we had the presentation of the signing ceremony behind me here in the East Room. What was meant to be a half-an-hour ceremony ended up to be a 90-minute ceremony. But essentially what he was saying is that the US concerns about the economic relationship had been addressed, and that both sides have been able to come together and chart a way forward. Let's listen.
So China has made substantial and enforceable commitments regarding the protection of American ideas, trade secrets, patents, and trademarks. This was not, according to most, they didn't know we covered any of this. We've covered a lot of this. It's Phase 1, but they're doing many more things in Phase 1 than anyone thought possible.
And I think part of the reason that Phase 1 has been so ambitious is that essentially the US in May, when both sides backed down, remember, we almost talked about a collapse of the talks, was telling China to change its laws and do this and do that. But further analysis has shown that as the reform and opening up process continues anyway, a lot of these were being addressed. So it's essentially a balancing act between hope and aspirations on both sides, and no more ordering each other what to do. And the implementation of these this agreement is actually up to both sides. So no one's going to tell each other what to do. But you're quite right. Tariffs remain, and that's something for phase two.
Right, Nathan. On those remaining tariffs, the bulk of the tariffs still remain. President Trump says they will be used as leverage in future talks, phase two of the negotiations. What do we know about the timing of that?
Well, I mean, it depends how you look at tariffs. The US president has always said, we're bringing in billions in tariffs, but essentially he knows that it's hurt the US economy. You just look at what happened to soybean farmers. You look at the bailouts that the US had to put in, higher than the rescue of the auto industry at the height of the financial crisis in 2008. This is a serious effect on a key constituency, not just the Trump presidency, but also the US heartland. So, he knew there was a problem. We don't know quite yet how these tariffs will be rolled back. We know, for example, that China will have to grant exemptions on tariffs for some of these goods to go into the US, from the US into China, because essentially otherwise they would be uncompetitive at market rates. So there's all this to be worked out. 2/3 of Chinese imports here are still tariffed, about $360 billion worth, between 7.5% and 25%. But the key point here is for phase two, and we still haven't got an answer on this. Are we going to wait till all the remaining problems between the US and China are worked out before the lifting of tariffs? Is this the new normal? Or, as some have suggested, are we going to get incremental deals? Phase 2A, Phase 2B, Phase 2C, and tariffs by either side will be lifted then. We'll wait and see. That sounds like the approach that the US administration may pursue along with Beijing, but of course it's an election year here in the US, so everything's a bit up in the air.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting from the White House. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Jeff Moon is a former assistant U.S. trade representative for China Affairs. Yan Liang heads the economics department at Willamette University in Portland, Oregon. James Moore is the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. And John Gong is an economics professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Thank you to everyone for being with us. John Gong, let me start with you. This is phase one of the deal. It compels China to buy $200 billion worth of American goods over the next 2 years. Lots of other provisions concerning technology transfers and restrictions on the Chinese acquisition of technology companies here in the United States. And the U.S., of course, will remove tariffs on about 1/3 of the goods it imports from China. What did you make of the agreement, and what does China get out of this deal?
Well, I think it's using President Trump's word, it's a momentous deal. It's a landmark deal. I think it's very important in the historic context. In the past, there are precedents where nations go to war because of trade. China went into two wars with UK about trade. United States was founded on a dispute of trade with UK as well. So we understand that there are those school of thought, strategic thinkers in the United States, advocating a confrontational approach with China. And I think what happened yesterday is a loud slap on their face that the current administration in Washington is not going to go down that path, that we are going to come up with some kind of agreement, as we witnessed yesterday, that both countries will continue to have an economic relationship. And I think in that context, in that historic context, this is indeed a momentous deal that we're both able to come to some agreement. If you look at this, there are things pertaining to areas where China is going to do anyway. For example, the protection of intellectual property rights, so-called forced technology transfer. These things are already taking actions about these things in China. We have a recent law that just went into effect, essentially prohibiting forced technology transfer, right? There's an explicit provision in that act. I think the most significant concession on the Chinese side has made is about that $200 billion over 2 years. And I think this is something quite reasonable. I think this is something that can be realized, can be implemented. Most of the sorry, go ahead.
I want to get to James Moore. James Moore, we heard there from John Gong saying this is momentous, historic. Do you agree?
Not completely. I think there's much to be seen. I think this has been an important first phase. We know that President Trump, for example, in the not too distant future, will be flying to China for the purpose of beginning to launch the second phase of discussions over all this. To be able to require the Chinese to purchase an additional $200 billion worth of goods over the next 2 years is one heck of a healthy pace to be able to reach. And I think we'll all be sitting back to see whether or not they're able to do that. I think it's important to recognize, as was underscored, that 2/3 of all the products that are being shipped to the United States from China do have tariffs applied to them. That compares with 1% when the Trump administration came into office. And so this has, I think, been an important time out. But at the end of the day, the single greatest problem that exists between the United States and China are the systemic differences that exist between in each of our countries. And until we're able to really explore and be able to define, understand, and take certain measures about those differences, we're going to continue to butt heads.
James, just one quick point on the tariffs that remain. Do you see incremental changes in that, or will the United States be looking for some kind of comprehensive, huge deal that will remove all those tariffs?
Well, if we get into the details on this after President Trump has been reelected, I can tell you there's going to be a very strong President Trump who is going to be at the table going after these systemic changes. You know, it's relatively easy in the scheme of things to be able to deal with tariffs, and to be able to tell China, we want you to purchase all these goods. But at the end of the day, that's somewhat cosmetic in terms of taking care of the long-term considerations.
Yan Liang, this was phase one of the deal. It was the result of very long and tough negotiations. On balance, would you say both sides got what they wanted? The Americans are saying, we won. Yan Liang, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
You got cut off a little. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me repeat that question for you. I was just saying that this is phase one of the deal, and it was a result of very long, hard negotiations. Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary here in the United States, says this is a big win for the United States. But did both sides get what they wanted?
I'm not really sanguine about this statement. I think, for one, we still need to see the implementation of that. So I think your previous speakers talked about this $200 billion purchases in 2 years, reasonable. But I wanted to point out that, you know, in addition to the $50 billion of agriculture products purchase, which is reasonable, that basically puts China back to where 2017, you know, when China imports about $25 billion of agriculture products from the U.S. But now that China has switched some of the purchases to countries like Brazil and Argentina, it will take some adjustments. But I'm more worried about the manufactured goods. So that's about $35 billion a year, $75 billion spent in the span of 2 years. But if you look at 2017, China imported about $16 billion worth of aircraft, 10 billion of motor vehicles, and 5 billion of integrated circuits from the United States. But now, after the Boeing 737 MAX fiasco, and then also the refusal of the U.S. to sell to, you know, China's ETZ and Huawei, you know, integrated circuits and some other high-tech products, I'm really not sure where the U.S. is going to come up with that $35 billion of manufactured goods to sell to China. So to me, this is not a demand problem, but of a supply side problem. And then the second point, I think it's really the remaining, you know, $360 billion of Chinese goods are still subject to tariffs, and that pushed the average tariff rate to about 18 to 20%, which is much higher than before. It not only hurt China's exports, but more importantly, it really hurt the U.S. businesses and consumers. The Congressional Budget Office just ran the estimate that since January 2018, the tariffs to China and all other countries have shedded the U.S.'s growth rate by 0.3%, and that decreased the household income by about $580 per year. So I think the tariffs, as long as it's still in place, it's hurting U.S., China, and hurting the global economy. And then the last point is, I think there are a lot of more thorny and very vexing issues about China's industry policies and whatnot are still remained unresolved, and that's going to be really tough for the so-called Phase 2 deal. And I think the so-called enforcement mechanism, if you really look into it, the so-called disproportionate reaction, I think it has a lot of practical and real difficulties. So I think this is just a truce. It's one step to the right direction, but I think it's way too early to call it a victory or to celebrate the trade deal right now.
Jeff Moon, that's a key point that Yan Liang raises there. We have the numbers now. We know what the numbers are all about, but one side has to buy, the other side has to sell. One side has to have demand, the other side has to have supply. How difficult is that going to be?
I think she raised a lot of good points, that being one of them. The question about whether the U.S. can produce and China can consume, I have the same question. And so we're in uncharted territory. You know, trade deals don't traditionally involve purchases. Purchase deals usually happen when state leaders visit or things like that. So this deal is unique in many, many ways. And I think we're in the realm of the unknown as to whether these things can be performed. And there is a potential trap here because there are penalties for non-performance. Right. And so I think the Chinese side has been legitimately concerned about fuzzy numbers and whether they can meet those numbers and whether then that will involve some unnecessary friction here.
You know, Jeff, you were sitting in that very same chair 2 days ago and you said this was a missed opportunity. Now that we have more details, is it significant now, this deal, for you?
I'm much less enthusiastic than John and some other folks. Yeah. I think this is a purchase agreement. Mm-hmm. Essentially, it does not address the industrial policy issues that are the real core of the trade dispute. It does involve a number of perennial issues that have been out there. The other non-purchase issues were all on the table when I was at USTR a few years ago. And the progress is incremental. This is an organic extension of discussions that came before. So there's nothing unique there.
What about things like technology transfers, the restrictions on Chinese companies buying technology companies here?
Well, if you read the agreement, I was trying to look through it today quickly, it's very high level, it's very vague, and it's not clear how the Chinese are going to actually meet these requirements. The language sounds great, but how you put that into action is a question to my mind. If the Chinese are going to say, we passed an investment law that has a ban on forced technology transfer, then that is insufficient. Because if you read that law and you read the implementing regulations that came out in December, yes, there is a ban, but there is no specificity on the process for processing violations or whether there are even any penalties. So it's entirely possible that a violation could result in a verbal reprimand and nothing more.
But if the U.S. believes that this agreement is not being implemented, let's say the spirit of the agreement, then it can reimpose tariffs.
It can, and that raises other issues, practical issues that are unique and we haven't seen before in these kinds of agreements. Let's suppose I'm a company and I feel that I've been subject to forced technology transfer. The process, as I understand it, is I have to take this over to USTR. They take it through junior, medium, and senior levels, and then they decide the only tool they have is tariffs. So how are they going to calculate the tariffs that are applicable to one case involving one company? You know, when you really think about what's going to happen on the ground, there's a lot to be worked through, and it doesn't sound all that practical in many ways.
And John, there is something else, and this pertains to what Jeff was telling us a moment ago. I mean, for instance, China says it will buy up to $50 billion worth of U.S. agricultural produce annually over the next 2 years. But there is an important caveat in that agreement. Let's listen to the Chinese Vice Premier Liu He explain that caveat. Let's listen here.
The two sides have agreed, based on the market demand in China, in line with current markets, Chinese businesses will purchase $40 billion of agricultural products from the United States annually. If the demand is strong, the companies may buy more.
So the key words there are, if the demand is strong. What if there's no demand? John?
Well, I think that number is still very much within the reach. You know, the soybean, you look at soybeans about, a 10 to $20 billion business. And then what's addition, I think, from the situation in 2017 is the imports of beef and pork. I think particularly with respect to pork, there's a huge demand here in China, and America has very competitive products in that regard. So I think there's a little bit of a wiggle room when it comes to purchases in agriculture products. China is buying a lot of these things anyway around on the international markets. So I think there's a room to increase these amounts. I also want to talk a little bit about that $77 billion of manufactured goods. Yeah. Keep in mind, this is over 2 years. So every year, it's just only about on average, about $35 to $37 billion. And that amount, I think, is still quite within reach. I mean, it's, Huawei alone itself buys about like $10 billion of semiconductor products and other products, electronic products, on a yearly basis. So I think, if we have a satisfactory solution, I think with respect to Huawei, and in the eyes of President Trump, Huawei issue is essentially a political issue. So I would expect that the administration would try to come up with ways to help with the Silicon Valley, the semiconductor industry in the United States, to try to sell more products to the Chinese market. In addition to the semiconductor markets, I think there are also increased demand in the chemicals. If you look at that table, there's a little footnote about the other goods, and that includes chemical products. The United States is a big supplier of chemical products to China. So I think there's going to be a lot of demand there. And I hope that Boeing would recover from its 737 MAX project and sell more airplanes to China.
So James, John says there's going to be a lot of demand in China for U.S. goods. I mean, if we look at some of the specifics here, China would buy U.S. manufactured goods, including aircraft, $52 billion in energy products, and almost $38 billion in services. Is that good for the U.S. economy? How big is it?
It's good for the U.S. economy, but one of the things we have to remember, and that is that business ultimately is very agile in trying to be able to meet the demands of the marketplace. We were just mentioning Huawei, which has been kind of the elephant in the room during these negotiations. Right. We talk about China-U.S. Trade relationships, but I can tell you the tech industry has been on the doorstep of the administration talking about Huawei in a major way. And yet the CEO of Huawei recently made clear that it has been able to figure out other ways to be able to deal with semiconductors in purchasing from other markets. And so the United States has to be very careful, because at the end of the day, the businesses could very well go in a different direction in terms of how they are actually meeting market demand, and I think the administration is becoming more and more sensitive. That's why, in fact, this agreement was put together, particularly at with the push of President Trump, because there's no question that consumers here in the United States have felt the effects of these tariffs. I think at the end of the day, and I think this is important, we are rewriting economic theory and history by having the world's two exceptionally large economies dealing in a trade deal. Whereas we catch pneumonia, or we catch a cold, I should say, the rest of the world catches pneumonia. Right. And so they're trying to figure out exactly what the ramifications are for their own manufacturers and their own consumers.
Yan Liang, I mean, if we look at this, there are questions of how this is going to work. Let's look at one example. If China promises, say, to buy $10 billion worth of soybeans, who's doing the buying? Is it the Chinese government, Chinese food processing companies? Is it Chinese consumers? And can you force people to buy stuff?
Well, that's a great question. I think that's precisely the point.
Sorry, go ahead, Yan Liang.
So, on the one hand, President Trump wants China to be more of a market economy, but on the other hand, he seems to agree that the Chinese government should somehow mandate the private enterprises or the consumers to purchase soybeans from the United States. So I don't think we can achieve both at the same time. So there is a question about, where the market demand is going, how much the market demand is going to be, and where the Chinese are going to buy these agricultural products from. So I think, again, it's not very clear, even though it's possible for China to purchase, up to $40 billion of agricultural products from the United States, but it's still possible that, that's not exact number that would show. But I think it's a, going forward, I think it's more important that, going back to Jeff Moon's point, I think it's a great point about this sort of enforcement mechanism. What if China is not able to buy 40 billion? What if it's 35 billion? Then what would happen to the tariffs? Because the whole matrix to measure China's enforcement of the trade agreements, and it's not clear when will trigger that increase in tariff. And plus, I think, switching tariff back on and off, it's really bad for business because it really increased business uncertainty, it shattered business confidence. It would make it very difficult for the business world to maneuver with sort of the tariffs as an enforcement mechanism.
Jeff, we've got a few minutes left. I have to ask you about phase 2. I mean, still question marks, as we've heard, over phase 1. But President Trump says he will negotiate phase 2 personally after the election. He's very confident he will still be president. What are the U.S. priorities for phase 2?
Well, Trump's priorities, and that's the most important thing in this equation, I think, is politics. Today was political theater in many ways, and Trump, I think, sees this in political terms. He always thinks short-term and domestic. My personal theory is that he feels he's gained enough points out of this exercise that he can postpone the China trade issue past his election and thereby avoid accountability for the failure of the phase 2 trade talks to result in anything. People will go through the motions, they will have some talks, but I think it's very unlikely that Trump wants to reach an agreement before the election and thereby become accountable for what's in there and what's not in there. And I think it's very unlikely that they can actually address the industrial policy issues. So I think after this, we're going to see Trump start to divert attention away from China after he exaggerates.
But he's going to sell this, isn't he?
He's going to sell this and he's going to exaggerate it, and that's already been happening, all the superlatives and adjectives, and that will continue. Right. And during the rest of the campaign season, he may say a few things about China. He may even impose a tariff, a small tariff on whim, just to show the voters that he's being tough. But he'll play this beyond the election.
Right, let me go to John Gong very quickly. John, we've got a minute left. Of course, we know that China plays a very long game in these kinds of negotiations. What is China's what are China's priorities for phase 2?
Well, I think China wants to continue to, maintain this very helpful and productive economic relationship with the United States. But I want to make a point here that, even though there are those issues, so-called structural issues, things related to industrial policy and subsidies, these things are addressable, in my opinion. I don't think these things are fundamentally at odds with the political system, economic development model here. And also, I think Washington tends to inflate and exacerbate the effect of these things. I mean, President Trump talks about $5 trillion of U.S. trade deficit accumulated over the years. And how can you explain that this $5 trillion is entirely attributed to the industrial policy, the subsidies? These things might be helpful a little bit, but at the end of the day,
John,
it's the competitive businesses. It's the Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I got to go. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.